Well, hello, one and all. Welcome to our first DOTS Live webinar of 2025. Now that the Commission has released its working program, which probably attracted all of you guys' attention here in Brussels, everyone is closely looking at Germany as it's approaching its snap federal elections on February 23rd to see how the results could reshape the political landscape of one of EU's most influential member states. My team and I have been following the campaign closely. And as part of our dedicated German election package, in this exclusive webinar, we will examine the key policy debates that have been driving the campaign, the possible election outcomes, and their implications for Germany's role in Europe and on the global stage. I'm Tarek Oran, team leader of the German team here at DOTS Political Intelligence, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our webinar. With me here today to discuss all the important insight is my fantastic team, Vera Biebers and Julia Brandkamp. Vera is our health and environment expert and will give a brief recap on how we ended up having these snap elections. She will further give an overview of what has happened in the campaigns thus far. Julia, our energy, industry and trade consultant, will then take over to highlight some key policy sectors and where the major parties position themselves on how to tackle the issues at stake. I will then follow up and shed some light on possible coalition options and some key implications of a new government for Germany, the EU, and globally. Finally, you, the audience, have the opportunity to ask all things related to the elections, so stay tuned in until the end. If you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box and we will pick them up later. But before we start, I also want to highlight that all webinar attendees will get a special discount for any new or additional DOTS product they acquire. Just get in touch with our customer service to find out more. With that being said, I'm now happy to hand over to my colleague Vera.
Thank you, Tarek. A warm welcome from my side as well. My name is Vera, and as Tarek mentioned, I'll talk you a bit through the lead up to this election, to the snap elections that we're now having in February, and the key topics that kind of define the election cycle. So before we have a look at this timeline here that you can see on the slides, I want to take you a bit further back to 2021, which is when Germany's first three-party coalition came into power, consisting of the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberals. And it kind of promised a fresh political era after 16 years of a Merkel-led Christian democratic rule. However, it became quite quickly clear that it would be defined by a lot of public infighting and big conflicts, especially on spending, Ukraine aid, and climate and transport policies. Those were kind of the three main points of dispute. And that came at a time when the government was already struggling with the consequences of Russia's invasion, rising energy costs, and inflation. So a few major conflicts that I want to point out are, first of all, the controversial heating law, which was primarily shaped by the Greens, and it was highly unpopular because it came at a time when the energy costs were surging. So it required costly updates to residential heating systems and was therefore quite unpopular in the public's eye, and highlighted the deep ideological divides between the Greens and especially the Liberals, with the Liberals on the one side resisting a lot of climate investments, and then the Greens on the other hand demanding urgent action. However, the biggest dispute was probably the controversial budget strategy to bypass the national debt brake, so our Schuldenbremse, where the coalition parties wanted to take unused COVID funds and then redirect them into the Climate and Transformation Fund. That was eventually invalidated by the court in 2023 and left a massive budget hole of 60 billion euros. Which obviously strained the alliance a lot, with disagreements on whether it should be reformed or not. And that led eventually to the final blow, which came in late 2024, when an exit strategy basically got leaked from the Liberals under the leadership of our former finance minister, Christian Lindner. So that brings us to the timeline here, because he was dismissed on the 6th of November in consequence of that leaked strategy paper, which was then followed by a couple of more minister resignations and new appointments, and eventually brought us to the 11th of December when Olaf Scholz called for the vote of confidence. As kind of expected and anticipated, he lost that vote on the 16th of December and then called on our federal president to dissolve our government. That dissolution then took place on the 27th of December, so at the end of last year, and they set a date for the snap elections happening now in less than 2 weeks. So as you can see here on the timeline, we expect exploratory talks after the election now in February, and then coalition negotiations. And most likely our new chancellor, Friedrich Merz, announced or reconfirmed this weekend that he aims to conclude the formation of the new government before Easter. So we would expect a government to form at the end of April, more or less. Yeah. With that timeline in mind, you can see that the coalition's official breakup came right after Trump's re-election on the 5th of November, which obviously fueled a lot of uncertainty over transatlantic relations, trade policies, and so on. So, and meanwhile, you had France, another key actor, having their own political crisis after a vote of no confidence. So you suddenly had two of Europe's largest economies in turmoil, with concerns growing about the EU's ability to kind of respond swiftly to global challenges. And then you had Trump's kind of looming inauguration. And with that, I want to talk a bit more about what defined our election cycle so far. So especially at the beginning of the election campaign cycle, we focused a lot on the economy and Trump, to be honest. So the two main topics that came with his re-election were concerns about defense and Ukraine aid, and the economy and his kind of like threatened tariffs. So in light of the threatened tariffs, there was a big debate about how to best strengthen the economy and EU's financial independence. And it ignited a kind of discussion about whether Europe's foreign policy should focus on a stronger Europe and more independence from the US. And then you had others arguing for stronger transatlantic relations and more trade agreements, for instance, with the US. The other topic that came with Trump's inauguration, or his re-election rather, was the discussion on how Ukraine will need more support from the German side. So the Christian Democrats, the Greens, and the Social Democrats advocate for a continued commitment, but disagree quite a lot on the specifics, which is, for instance, reflected in Olaf Scholz famously blocking the Taurus missile deliveries, and quite recently a €1 billion aid package that was supported by the Greens, but also parts of the Social Democrats. So for instance, our Minister for Defense, Boris Pistorius, who was favored by a lot of people to be the Social Democratic Chancellor candidate, he was quite vocally pushing for this aid package, and Olaf Scholz wanted to block it. And then on the opposite side of the pro-Ukraine support spectre, you have the AfD and the Alliance, Sarah Wagenknecht, who call for diplomatic negotiations with Russia and emphasize a shift towards dialogue rather than military aid. Another topic that I quickly want to touch upon was the kind of like outbidding situation that we had at the beginning of the election cycle, where all the major parties kind of outbid themselves with their demands for a higher defense spending. So notably, the Greens have called for a 3.5% allocation of the GDP, which would exceed the 2% NATO commitment that we barely reach at the moment. And then you had the Christian Democrats on the other side, who said that the 2% target that we currently have should be the baseline, but didn't specify the maximum that they would try to achieve. And then quite the opposite, you have the AfD that even though they didn't commit to a figure per se, they openly expressed support for Trump's demand for 5% of the GDP that should be allocated to defense. With Trump also came Elon Musk and his vocal support for the AfD, which I just briefly want to talk about. So he publicly endorsed the AfD, including digital appearances at party conferences, discussions with Alice Weidel on X, and so on. And that sparked quite an intense debate about foreign influence in Germany's election and in European elections as a whole. And on that note, you should see a quick poll popping up any minute now, because we'd like to hear your thoughts on how concerning you think the involvement of foreign influential figures such as Elon Musk in European politics is, and whether it should be limited. So just give us a quick vote. We'll talk about the results at the end, and there should also be a timer running out after 2 minutes or so. So concerning Musk's kind of meddling in Germany's elections, I think it's fair to say that his endorsement is unlikely to directly sway voter outcomes, but it does carry quite a significant symbolic weight and highlights sort of the growing appeal of populism, wide-ranging policies, and calls into questions the role of social media and influential figures that legitimize extremist positions within the mainstream discourse, so to say. So after the economy, Trump, and so on were kind of the primary topics in the beginning of the election cycle, that changed quite a bit now in January, when migration has become the topic for the upcoming elections, overshadowing basically all traditional campaign topics such as climate and social policies, but also economic and fiscal policies. So that was largely due to there we go. That was largely due to a series of violent attacks in Solingen, Magdeburg, and Aschaffenburg, which intensified the public debate and fueled calls for stricter migration controls. With that, even the centrist parties were forced to adopt a tougher rhetoric and shifting their focus away from their kind of preferred topics. Okay, we're having a couple of complications with the PowerPoint, but I think it should be fine, potentially. I'll talk you through my slide now, which hopefully will stick for now. So after the centrist parties were kind of forced to adopt a stricter approach, the Christian Democrats in particular kind of emerged as a party that positioned themselves for a change in migration reform, and they openly distance themselves from Angela Merkel's legacy. So they kind of argue for a 180 turn in the more liberal stance to migration. And that controversy peaked when Christian Democrats relied on AfD votes to pass a stricter migration policy motion, so it wasn't a law, in parliament, which marked the first time that a party willingly aligned with the far right. So this move triggered a political outrage. Even Angela Merkel herself condemned Friedrich Merz's willingness to collaborate with the AfD, and it kind of peaked in nationwide protests under the slogan of "Never again is now," which highlights the public resistance to the right, basically. And those protests go hand in hand with the bigger debate about how to deal with the right and whether the so-called Brandmauer, like the firewall against the right, is the best way to counteract their influence. Yeah, so this topic will very much define the election and will continue to play a big role after the elections. So to bring my section to close, I quickly want to highlight a few logistical challenges and novelties that come with those snap elections now. One major concern is the uncertainty about the timely counting of mail-in votes, particularly those from Germans living abroad. So maybe a few of you listening are also impatiently waiting for the letters to come in, as are we, and are anxious about whether or not they'll be able to vote in time. So because Germans living abroad number around 3 to 4 million, so it could make quite a significant difference, especially since they don't usually tend to lean towards voting AfD. That's one thing to keep in mind. Another is that there was quite a big discontent of smaller parties who have raised concerns regarding the requirement to gather signatures to participate in the elections, because this process disproportionately favors larger established parties. And it was kind of, it was kind of a big topic in the beginning after they called the SNAPTA elections that these concerns kind of came up. But yeah, the last final thing that I want to mention is that for these elections, it's the first elections that will be affected by the electoral reform of 2023, meaning it will limit, this reform limits the size of our parliament of the Bundestag to only 630 members. And in the previous government, we had a record size of 736, so nearly 100 members in parliament less, which is, I think, quite important to keep in mind. But yeah, that finishes my section of the webinar, and I would now hand over to my colleague Julia, who will talk you through the election programs and their priorities for Germany.
Yeah, thank you, Vera. And so I'm Julia, and I'm quickly going to talk through some of the main demands of the parties that are running in this election. And I especially want to focus on the sectors migration, economy, and foreign policy, as those are our main issues of this election, and especially foreign policy should be interesting for most of you guys. So let me start with migration policy, which has emerged as a dominant issue in the current 2025 federal election. So let me start with the CDU-CSU, and they're calling for a fundamental change in migration policy with a strong focus on national security. Their main objective is to stop illegal migration, limit humanitarian admission, and regain control over migration. They propose German border controls, consistent rejections at the border, and suspension of family reunification for many migrants. They want to change European asylum law and move asylum seekers to safe third countries. Meanwhile, the SPD, so our current Chancellor party, focuses on integration and a humanitarian responsibility. They advocate for expanding integration courses and a participation law to promote equal rights and opportunities for migrants across all areas, including education, the labor market, and political life. The SPD is committed to orderly migration, especially into the labor market, but they also emphasize the need to control irregular migration and accelerate asylum procedures through a common European asylum system. They further aim to combat causes of migration through international cooperation. Then we have the Greens, who are also part of the current government, and they advocate for a welcoming culture that attracts skilled workers and support integration. They favor family unification and want to strengthen European migration policies with a fair distribution system for asylum seekers and advocate for a common European migration policy. They oppose outsourcing asylum procedures to third countries and support continuation of civil sea rescue missions in the Mediterranean. Then we have our far-right party, the AfD, and they emphasize country control over who enters Germany. They advocate for no entry for asylum seekers from third countries, and they want to process asylum claims outside of Germany entirely. They favor swift deportation and want to eliminate immigration quotas and redistribution quotas for asylum seekers. They also believe family reunification for people with subsidiary protection should be abolished. The Paper Party for this drastic reduction, limiting supporting to humane subsistence level and non-cash benefits wherever possible. Then I just quickly want to mention three parties and their main also demands for this, but they are not likely to get into the parliament, or they're currently struggling to get into the parliament considering recent polls. But Tari is going to mention that a bit later. I just quickly want to run through them because they're still quite important. And first, the FDP, who was part of our government until November. And they're favoring making immigration into the labor market easier, including for non-academic workers, fast asylum procedures, especially in third countries, and propose a centralized approach for returns and deportations. They also want to suspend family reunification for people with subsidiary protection. The left, on the other hand, reject deportations and believe refugees should be allowed to work from day one. They're against outsourcing asylum procedures to third countries and focus instead on legal entry routes. The BSW, so the Sarah Wagenknecht Party, they are in favor of ending uncontrolled migration as they believe it poses a security risk and overwhelms society. They want to allow refugees with protection status to enter the job market quickly and advocate for asylum procedure to be carried out outside the EU. So just to sum up the migration policy demands, the SPD, Greens and Left emphasize integration, humanitarian responsibility and fair treatment for migrants. The CDU, CSU, so the Union, the AfD and BSW focus on stricter control, national security and focusing on the reduction of the number of migrants entering the country. The FDP strikes a middle ground, proposing efficiency and incentives for migrants to integrate quickly into the labor market. Next up, I want to talk about the economic policy demands, as Germany currently grapples with several critical economic challenges. And while all parties recognize the need to lower energy costs and ease bureaucratic burdens, their solution reflects the contrasting economic philosophies. So starting with our conservatives, so the CDU and CSU, they aim to permanently reduce electricity prices by lowering the electricity tax to the EU minimum and cutting grid fees. They propose a comprehensive tax reform, reducing corporate taxes on retained profits to 25%, and also plan to significantly deregulate by reducing reporting and verification obligations and reforming federal administration. They further seek to expand infrastructure with focus on grid expansion, linking renewable energy grids and storage. The SPD supports high investments through a Germany fund and a Made in Germany bonus. They plan to digitalize administration and simplify processes at all levels of government. They want to cap grid fees to lower electricity prices, support decreasing the VAT on food to ease the cost of living. Let's move on to the Greens. They prioritize investment in future technologies and plan to make energy permanently cheap through investment in renewables and an accelerated approval process. They're also planning a Deutschlandfonds or Germany fund for investment in infrastructure and industries. The party advocates for reduced electricity tax and state assumption of grid fees for supranational power lines. So the AfD then, they have a very different stance here because they reject any climate-related subsidies and regulation, calling for an end to the energy transition and EU climate policy as they don't believe in man-made climate change. They want to reintroduce nuclear power and propose cutting income, consumer and corporate tax while increasing the tax-free allowance. Moving on to our smaller parties here, the FDP calls for reducing the tax burden on businesses to below 25% by abolishing the solidarity surcharge and cutting corporate taxes. They plan to an ambitious reduction in bureaucracy and want to reduce electricity tax to the EU minimum and abolish it in the long term. The left propose a 200 billion euro investment fund to help companies restructure. They advocate for employee ownership of companies through corporate loans and also want state funding tied to guarantees of job security, collective agreements, and location commitments. Lastly, the BSW proposed reducing energy prices through economic trade agreements, including with Russia, and support infrastructure investment, including transport, schools, and energy networks exempt from the debt brake. So as I mentioned now in the end, the debt brake, and it's one of the major issues in our current election. And because it is an issue on how to finance the tax reforms and investment that everyone is calling for. So the SPD, Greens, and Left are in favor of a reform, while the CDU, FDP, and AfD want to keep the debt brake. So in conclusion, there's a consensus on reducing energy costs, but CDU, FDP, and AfD favor a market-driven approach, whereas the SPD, Greens, Left, and also BSW advocate more state intervention. So now I want to move to foreign policy and the EU. So probably the topic that is most interesting for all of you. And starting with the CDU, they want to strengthen the EU's influence and see Germany as a leader in Europe. They're committed to supporting Ukraine, and they want Germany to drive a peace process and secure Ukraine's EU membership prospects while increasing sanctions on Russia. They emphasize deepening ties with France, Poland, and the UK, and NATO remains indispensable in their opinion to their strategy, and they are committed to spending at least 2% of the GDP on defense. The SPD shares some of the CDU's position, but with a stronger emphasis on European autonomy. They want Europe to be able to provide its own security, reducing reliance on external powers while still considering NATO indispensable. They also emphasize the importance of the United States for Germany. Further, they advocate for consequent actions against EU regulation breaches and want to enforce the majority principle in EU decision-making. Regarding Ukraine, they support financial, humanitarian, and economic assistance along with arms deliveries, though they oppose sending the Taurus cruise missiles, which has been a huge debate. The Greens advocate for a federal European Republic with its own constitution, so they're the strongest EU supporters. They support giving the European Parliament the right to introduce its own legislative proposals and enforcing stricter penalties for EU members who violate the rule of law. The Greens also want more European strategic cooperation and believe Germany should take more responsibility within NATO, with defense spending exceeding 2% of the GDP. They have a firm stance on Ukraine, advocating for both military and civilian support. And then we move on to the AfD. They propose that Germany should leave the EU and create a new European alliance focused on economic and strategic interests. Their defense strategy calls for an independent European defense alliance to reduce the reliance on NATO. They further support increased defense spending, including reintroducing compulsory military service, but they oppose deepening NATO ties. They do not condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine and instead see Ukraine as a neutral state outside the EU and NATO. So then with this topic, moving on to our smaller parties, the FDP strongly is pro-EU, but they want an institutional reform. They further advocate for closer European cooperation on security and defense. The party supports further sanctions on Russia and on an EU-wide ban on Russian gas and oil imports. They propose a defense budget of at least 2% of the GDP, with the possibility of going beyond that depending on the NATO requirements. The left takes the pacifist approach and wants far-reaching reforms of the EU, including EU-wide referendums and greater powers for the European Parliament. They're against military expansion and call for Germany to leave NATO and to reduce defense spending. They support diplomatic solutions to conflicts and peace initiatives in Ukraine rather than military support. The BSW prioritizes returning powers to individual EU member states rather than pursuing deeper European integration, and they also oppose EU enlargement. They take a non-interventionist foreign policy stance, opposing arms deliveries and calling for lifting sanctions on Russia. Their goal is to integrate Russia into a future European security framework. And they also want to end all foreign deployments of the Bundeswehr, so our military. Concluding this and summarizing this, the left and the BSW advocate for leaving NATO, reducing defense expenditures, and pursuing diplomacy with Russia. The CDU, SPD, Greens, and FDP, so the majority of parties, are strongly pro-EU, advocate for more European cooperation, NATO support, and aid for Ukraine. They also all want to support at least the 2% GDP defense spending, though if they want to go above the 2% or not differs. And the AfD and BSW reject deep European integration, while the AfD also really supports a Brexit. So I want to now talk a bit about our candidates. So who are the faces to all of these parties? And first here, let me quickly wait for the slide to change. So here we go. I want to introduce to you our Chancellor and current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. He's the SPD, so center left. His biggest opponent is Friedrich Merz, who's most likely our next Chancellor, considering the most recent polls that Tarek is going to talk you through in a moment. And he's the Christian Democrat, so conservative. Then we have Robert Habeck, who's our Federal Minister for the Economy and Climate Protection. He's the main candidate of the Greens. And then we have Dr. Alice Weidel. She's from the AfD, so the right-wing populist party. And she's the one who recently also talked to Elon Musk. They have apparently quite close relationship in recent months. Then there are two other very present characters, and that's Christian Lindner, who's our former finance minister, and he's from the Liberals. And then we also have Sarah Wagenknecht, who formed the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, and she's the left-wing populist nationalist candidate. That mix in that party is a bit uncommon. The left candidates are not that present in current debates, so I excluded them from this poll. So I want to ask you now, in a question that should pop up in a second, as who do you think would be the best German Chancellor for Europe, so for the EU? And I would really appreciate if you would just give us a quick show of your opinion so that we can talk about this in a bit. Okay. you can just click that. And I'm thankful for everyone who participates in this election. And for that, in this poll, I want to hand over to Tarek, who's going to talk a bit more about the upcoming implications of this election.
Yes, thank you very much, Julia. Now that you already gave a very insightful overview of where the parties stand, let's take a quick look on how the campaign season and also the party positions have impacted the polling numbers. So, according to current polling numbers, the CDU-CSU is expected to win the most votes with about 30%. The AfD is supposed to come in second with around 20% and therefore doubling their seats in the Bundestag. Both the SPD and the Greens are currently polling at around 15%. There's some movement between those parties still. And yeah, as Julia also pointed out already, there are three parties, the FDP, the Left, and the BSW, who are currently battling the 5% threshold to enter parliament. But the Left Party has been on an upward trajectory recently, so more and more polls have them actually making the 5% threshold, and therefore they will most likely end up in the Bundestag. But for now, it will be really close, or it's still really close to call if these parties will actually make it. So now taking those polling numbers into account, I think it's a good moment to now talk about potential coalition options. As no party will have an outright majority, let's go over those. It seems inevitable that the CDU-CSU will win the election and that Friedrich Merz will become Germany's next chancellor. What doesn't seem as certain is how the coalition will look like. For now, I think there are two options likely. The more likely coalition, in my opinion, is another so-called Grand Coalition, consisting of the CDU-CSU and the Social Democrats, the SPD. This coalition would also be the more preferred ones by voters, according to recent polling. Since this coalition has governed for 3 legislative periods under Merkel's chancellorship, it will be a bit difficult to sell this coalition as a new start or like a fresh start to the people. With Merz as the opposition leader in recent years, the relationship between him and Scholz has soared especially in the past months leading up to the election, with many personal attacks between them. It is important here to point out that Scholz already announced that he would not be part of a cabinet led by Merz, so he would most likely leave the political stage for now. The parties clash on foreign policy, especially on how to deal with Ukraine and Russia, social welfare spending, and migration as well. With many red lines drawn up by the parties to underscore their coalition conditions in recent weeks, the exploratory talks and negotiations will be highly disputed. But I think this option seems more likely as the CDU-CSU believes that the SPD is more flexible in their position, especially on the migration issues. The migration issue is what makes the CDU-CSU and Greens coalition less likely. Although both parties are quite aligned on foreign policy, the CDU-CSU has, I think, good reasons to believe that the Greens would not easily accept their tougher stance on migration. The parties have also inherently different views on climate issues as well. Then again, it would also be strange for the CDU-CSU to explain the Greens as their junior partner to their core voter base after they have labeled the Green Party as their main enemy during the election campaign. Also, the party base of the Green voters would probably not necessarily accept the tougher stance on migration. I mean, there are probably also other options that could potentially happen, but I think these two options are more likely. And they are more likely to happen even if the small parties, the SPD, the FDP, BSW and the Left Party will not make the 5% threshold and does not make it to the Bundestag. The more parties would make it, the more unlikely its CDU, CSU and Greens majority will be, as the necessary seats would probably not be achieved. If all 7 parties would make it, a grand coalition would also most likely not even have the majority of seats, leaving a 3-party coalition as the only option. However, such a 3-way coalition is not politically desirable and would probably only be sought if there were no other democratic alternatives to the AfD. And here I can maybe highlight again that the AfD is not a coalition option for any party. Well, now that you have from Julia on the party's priorities and you know about these coalition options, it's time for another poll, I think. So which coalition would you prefer? There should be another poll coming up. Here we go. Yeah, maybe have a little think about and you can vote on there. Now, to conclude, I will go into more the key implications of the new government. With these coalitions options on hand, it will be interesting to see how it will impact the country, their position in the EU, and also its role on the global stage. First, let's focus on Germany for a bit. As Vera already mentioned, Merz is keen to get the government up and running as quickly as possible after the elections, ideally by Easter. His party already put out a 15-point immediate action program even, out with limiting illegal migration, the introduction of an active pension, and lower electricity prices as the first things on the agenda. Although he wants to get everything up and running as quickly as possible, it's important to point out here that the council, the Federal Council, also has a say in the legislative process in Germany. And that is currently divided along party lines as well. So you have some states, federal states, that are run by the CDU, and you also have some states that are run by the SPD, and they also have a say in the legislative process. So contrary to maybe Trump-style executive orders, Merz's power will somewhat be constrained. I think the main issue that the new government has to deal with in the upcoming legislative period is the federal debt brake, the so-called Schuldenbremse. Both Vera and Julia also briefly talked about it before. Many economists and labor unions, for instance, have called for much needed reform, as there is a need for additional investment at federal, states, and also local level, to modernize infrastructure, renovate schools, and also for climate action. According to the Federation of German Industries, there's an additional public sector investment need of around 400 billion euros required over 10 years. So that's a lot of money, right? But Merz had previously categorically ruled out such a reform, but he has softened his stance since. It seems likely that the new government will ultimately have to come up with some sort of reform of the debt brake rule. During the first TV debate on Sunday, Merz said that tackling such a reform would not be an immediate action to follow up on, though. With those tight budgeting rules in place, defense spending will also be a highly contentious topic, which needs to be addressed by the new government. Although Germany is now hitting its NATO spending goal of 2% of GDP, it is only due to a 100 billion special fund that Scholz initiated during his landmark Zeitenwende speech. And those funds will run out in 2028, so there's an additional funding gap of, some people say 30 billion, some even quote the number being 60 billion. So yeah, there's quite a big hole to fill. There are rumors that the government would maybe implement another special fund and therefore bypass the normal budget. But with a potential increase in the NATO goal, as recently proposed by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, yeah, Germany would probably even have to invest even more then. The proposal for joint financing via European defense bonds is rejected by Merz. He instead believes that simplification, standardization, and scale of the European defense industry would help lowering costs. This brings me to the key implications for the EU. Under Scholz's chancellorship, Germany's traditional leadership role in the EU has gone missing due to the constant infighting of his cabinet. Some of you probably heard about the German vote in council meetings whereby Germany would refrain from voting and therefore, not vote necessarily as in favor of one or the other party in government. Merz demands that Germany must once again speak with one voice in Europe. Ministers should be present at minister council meetings and all should have decent English language skills. As a former MEP, actually, from 89 to 94, he came up during the Maastricht Treaty era and German reunification, and is therefore firmly committed to a more integrated Europe. He agreed with the Letta report that there's a need to integrate European energy, telecommunications, defense, and capital markets. The Draghi report, however, and its call for issuing permanent EU joint debt were vehemently turned down by Merz. Maybe a word on his relationship with the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Apparently, they don't have the best relationship, but since they're hailing from the same party, they will most likely work closely together. Merz has complained that there are too many small-scale regulations from Europe, especially in the industrial and economic sector, that need to be addressed. So this is also something to look out for. As both Julia and Vera also talked about before, just one point on Ukraine. The likely future Chancellor Merz has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine, and he commented on the issue of ending the war, that it would be best to cooperate with the US, but he has also called for launching a new so-called contact group of Ukraine's European allies who are able, if necessary, to act independently of the United States in coordinating a peace plan. And this contact group would include France, the United Kingdom, and Poland. Merz has also complained that the previous government had let relations with France and Poland slide. He wants to repair those important links, and as Chancellor, his first priority would be to visit those two countries. The CDU also wants to deepen its cooperation with the United Kingdom, as it's in their mutual interest to work closely, especially in security policy. Now, talking about in the global aspect, I will focus on America and China because time is a bit running. With President Trump now back in the White House, Merz acknowledged that, and I quote, "This is no longer the America we used to know." But Merz is a devoted transatlanticist, and him and his party have repeatedly highlighted that Germany's most important ally outside the EU remains the US. He has called for a new free trade agreement with the US and doubled down on the need for a united Europe. According to Merz, the EU member states are waiting for Germany to take on a leading role on dealing with Trump. But taking note of Trump's economic measures against some of the US closest allies, Merz was clear that any tariffs placed on the European Union would be handled at the European level. When it comes to China, there are some key challenges that the future government has to deal with. There's obviously the risk of a hard decoupling in case of a military conflict in the Indo-Pacific, especially involving Taiwan. China has also demonstrated a willingness to use economic dependencies to exert pressure. And with tensions rising between the US and China, Germany, with its export-driven economic model, must also strategically reduce its dependencies on China on its own terms, instead of just reacting to US policies. And yeah, I think Germany must therefore secure its economic and political resilience by diversifying its supply chains and also reduce its critical dependencies on China. Merz has already warned domestic companies against making bigger investments in China, actually, and thus signaling a radical change from the more China-friendly course of previous German governments. Now, to conclude, and taking all these domestic and global key challenges into account, I think that the next government, and especially the new chancellor, has to make fundamental decisions in a new system that is emerging. You could even argue that historically only Konrad Adenauer and Helmut Kohl had such an enormous role, as they were chancellors at a time when pivotal decisions had to be made for Germany. One when the old international system collapsed in 1945, or was fundamentally transformed in 1990. And in both cases, there were also key domestic policy decisions to make. So one, you had the reconstruction of war-torn Germany, and in 1990, obviously, you had the reunification of East and West Germany. But if you really want to stay up to date on the coalition negotiations and the new government priorities, I want to briefly share some info on something that we've been working really hard on and are very proud of, our German election package. We will continue to provide timely analysis and insights up until the new government is formed. So now it's the perfect time basically to explore more about German politics with our tailored monitoring service here at DOTS. And as mentioned before, if you want to benefit from our exclusive offer to get a discount for any new or additional DOTS product, please get in touch with our customer service to find out more. And now I think let's focus on the Q&A and explore more about your questions. Okay, let me see. Okay, so we have one question about the Schuldenbremse, the debt brake, and I think Vera, you want to talk about this, so please go ahead.
Okay, so I should be on unmute now. I think Tarek talked about this a bit before, but the Christian Democrats, I'd say they were kind of open towards the reform, even though like they were previously more in favor of sticking to it. I think now under the pressure, they have kind of changed their views towards a more openness and willingness to reform it in one way or another, if anything, to kind of finance some of their proposals in election campaigns. So I don't think they are currently as vocal as, for instance, the Greens to reform the debt brake, but they may just have to be more willing to reform it in the future. So keep it brief.
Okay, thank you, Vera. We have a question on what about the option for a small party to gain a seat due to the direct mandate as the Linkspartei got in 2021? How would this disrupt potential majorities? Maybe Vera, you can also talk about this.
Yeah, otherwise I can also answer this if there's some technical issues. So there is definitely the option. So if you get 3 direct mandates, the German election system is a bit complicated. So we have direct votes. So we only have 2 votes for each person. One is for the direct candidate, one is for a party. And if a party doesn't get above the 5% threshold with the second vote, they usually don't get into the parliament unless they get 3 direct mandates from 3 constituencies. And the left has managed that in the last election It looks like they don't need it this year, but also they have put a lot of emphasis that they want to try this as well. And for the FDP, it's not that likely that they're going to manage 3 direct mandates, but that is technically a possibility. And also for the VSW, it also doesn't look too likely in that. But there we have to also look at Eastern Germany, where they are a lot more popular than in Western Germany. And how that would change the outcome. So that would actually have massive implications, because the more party are in the parliament, the fewer seats every party gets. And it might be in the end that we don't have enough seats from the CDU and the SPD to form a grand coalition, because then, as Tarek has already mentioned, the more gets in, the less seats they each get. And that would then make forming a coalition a lot more complicated, because a 3-party coalition has not been that stable in Germany's history. I mean, we only have one, and that didn't have the best outcome, I'd say.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Yeah, there's a question on the stance and view of Merz towards China. I think I briefly talked about it, but I will just elaborate once again. I think when it comes to relations from Germany to external or like partners outside the EU, I think what Merz is trying to achieve is to have a united Europe, and that he can speak from a position from the European perspective. And I think this will also apply towards China. China will obviously remain a big market for the German economy. But yeah, I think when it comes to the actual policy solutions, we can probably expect a more integrated European response. Then we have a question on the potential CDU-SPD government and what the priorities ministries for each party would be. So in this case, what we already know is that the CDU, or rather the CSU, so the Bavarian sister party, they already basically put out there that they want to get the agriculture ministry, and it's most likely going to be, I don't have the name on top of my head, but it's going to be someone who used to be from the German Farmers Association. So not necessarily a day-by-day politician, but someone who's actually from that sector. The SPD will most likely try to keep Pistorius as their defense minister, because he's quite popular. He's the most popular politician in Germany, and I think looking ahead into the 2029 elections already, I think they would benefit from him being in this position, and to basically regroup after this election, after they would probably lose, and therefore put him into a position of where they can present him on the big stage and potentially have him as the chancellor candidate for 2029. So there's another question on voting tendency by lenders and regions of Germany. Maybe Vera, that's something for you to answer.
Yeah, I mean, the clear tendency that we can see is the East-West divide, I'd say. So in the West, you have the traditional parties, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Greens dominating a bit more strongly, especially due to the economic conditions and more of the international focus, I'd say. And then in the East, you have obviously the AfD with a large increase in votes and support. So in comparison, I think they have an average of 32% in the East and 19% in the West, which is largely due to basically 3 factors, like historical identity, to be honest, and then the economic disparity kind of between the East and the West that's still very prominent in Germany, and then maybe a sort of political disillusionment that they don't feel as represented by the federal government. So I'd say the East-West divide is probably the biggest and most obvious tendency.
Okay, great. And I think then we have one more, which is, could you elaborate more on SPD's economic agenda? So as Julia talked about it during her presentation, I will give the stage to you, Julia.
Yes, thank you for that, Tarek. So the SPD is very much in favor of strengthening investment. That's why they want to reform the debt rate to finance more investment and to also reduce taxes on investment from Germany. So that's why they have their Germany fund or Made in Germany bonus. Especially Made in Germany bonus is a 10% decrease on taxes on any investment that's on any kind of corporation or company who are investing in their company in Germany. And they also want to strengthen collective bargaining so that their workers have higher wages in general. And then they're focused on lowering electricity prices, which has been a main issue there. They want to, if I remember correctly, the grid fees, they want to lower to 3 cents. And with that, they try to then also support electricity, as that is one of the major issues. And also, especially for the industry in Germany, the high electricity prices are one of the major factors here. And with then supporting or strengthening renewable energy and the construction of renewable energies, that is something that they're supporting with that, and then hopefully lowering energy prices in the long term with that. And I hope that answers your question. If you have any more specific question on that, I think I can. We have also written or summarized an overview of the party programs. If you're interested in that, I can also advise that one and maybe come in touch with customer service who can give you that if you want a more elaborate answer, because the SPD has like half their program is on economic.
Okay, great. Thank you, Julia, and thank you also, Vera, for answering all these questions. With 2 minutes to go, I think it's a good opportunity, to thank you all for tuning in today. It's always a really nice opportunity to, not necessarily see you guys, but to talk to a bigger audience. So thank you all for tuning in. If you want to stay in touch or have any questions, any follow-up questions, maybe that after the lunch break that you're all about to have comes up, please feel free to reach out. We are more than happy to answer all of your questions. And I think with that being said, I wish you all a very nice day. Take care and see you soon, maybe for another German webinar. But all the more informations you will receive in your inbox. You will also receive the recording of this webinar in your inbox. So thank you all and have a good day. Thank you.